You grow up in a camp where almost everyone feels like family. You share food with them, you sleep beside the same fire. You know every voice, every scar, and every argument. Then one day, strangers appear beyond the trees. They are not enemies, at least, not today. They bring stone from a distant valley, stories about another river, and people your age whom you have never met before. For a small prehistoric community, this meeting is not only about trade or friendship. It may be one of the reasons your descendants survive. Ancient humans lived in groups that could be small enough for close relatives to surround you. So how did they avoid having children only with cousins, siblings, or other close kin? They did not understand chromosomes. They had no word for recessive mutations. But they did not need a genetics textbook to build social systems that reduce the danger. Inbreeding happens when closely related people have children together. Close relatives are more likely to carry the same harmful genetic variant inherited from a shared ancestor. A child who receives that variant from both parents may face a greater risk of illness, developmental problems, or reduced fertility. That does not mean every child of relatives will be unhealthy. It means the risk increases, especially when close kin unions repeat across generations. For tiny populations, the problem is even harder. You can avoid marrying a sibling, but if your entire community has been isolated for generations, even apparently unrelated partners may share many distant ancestors. The solution was not simply to make the camp larger, it was to connect one camp to many others. One of the clearest clues comes from Sunghir, a famous Upper Paleolithic site in Russia. Around 34,000 years ago, several people were buried there with extraordinary objects, including thousands of beads and long spears made from mammoth ivory. Researchers later recovered DNA from fur of the individuals. The surprising result was that none of them were close biological relatives. Their genomes also showed low levels of recent inbreeding, even though the wider population from which they came was small. The researchers argued that these people probably belonged to residential groups connected to a much larger mating network. In other words, your daily camp might contain only a few families, but your social world could extend across a wide landscape. You might meet other groups beside a river during a seasonal fish run. You might gather at a rich hunting ground. You might visit relatives who had moved away. Objects, stories, songs, and potential partners could all travel between communities. A band that looked isolated on an ordinary morning might become part of a temporary crowd at another time of year. This is important because archaeologists once had to infer these networks mainly from tools and raw materials. A stone found hundreds of kilometers from its geological source could show that people or objects had moved. Shells carried inland could suggest long-distance exchange. Ancient DNA now allows researchers to see another layer of that movement. In 2021, Harold Ringbauer and colleagues examined genetic data from 1,785 ancient individuals who lived during the last 45,000 years. They searched for long stretches of matching DNA that reveal whether a person's parents were closely related. Only 54 individuals, roughly 3% of the sample, showed the pattern expected when the parents were cousins. The cases were scattered across different places and periods rather than concentrated in one ancient way of life. Even among hunter-gatherers who lived more than 10,000 years ago, unions between cousins were the exception, not the rule. This does not prove that every prehistoric society had a formal law against cousin marriage. Archaeologists cannot hear the rules spoken around a fire, but the genetic pattern shows that close relatives usually did not become partners by accident, even in communities with very small populations. There were probably several layers of protection. People knew family histories. They knew who your mother was, who your father was, who had raised you, and which neighboring group your grandparents came from. Kinship could be remembered through stories, names, obligations, and taboos. A society did not need to calculate genetic distance. It only needed rules such as, do not pair with someone from your own close family, seek partners from another camp, or move after forming a partnership. The exact rules would have varied enormously. In one society, a woman may have moved to her partner's community. In another, a man may have moved. Some couples may have shifted between both groups. Others may have joined a new group entirely. The important pattern is movement. Around 6,700 years ago, Some of the last hunter-gatherers of Atlantic France were buried at sites including Téviec, Hoedic, and Champigny. Scientists sequenced the genomes of 10 individuals from these communities. The groups were small, but most of the people buried together were not closely related. Researchers found no signs of recent inbreeding. Even women and children placed in the same grave were sometimes not biological family. The communities also appear to have mixed with other hunter-gatherer groups rather than with nearby farming populations. This suggests that they maintained social boundaries while still connecting to a broader network of people like themselves. So avoiding inbreeding was not the same as accepting everyone. A group could exchange partners with trusted allies while keeping distance from strangers viewed as competitors, outsiders, or culturally different. This makes the prehistoric world more complicated than a collection of isolated families. It was a web of relationships. Imagine that your group returns to the same valley every summer. Another group arrives from the coast. A third comes from the hills. The adults renew alliances. Children meet cousins they barely remember. Young people encounter potential partners who are not close relatives. A partnership links to communities. Now there is someone to visit, somewhere to shelter during a bad season, and another group that may share food when hunting fails. Avoiding inbreeding may have been one benefit of these connections, but not the only one. The same network moved stone, pigments, techniques, information, and support. This may be the deeper twist. Ancient humans did not solve a genetic problem with biology. They solved much of it with culture, but the system could fail. A high-quality genome from a Neanderthal woman who lived in the Altai Mountains showed that her parents were related at about the level of half-siblings. Other parts of her genome suggested repeated close relative mating among her recent ancestors. Neanderthals often lived in small populations, and some communities may have been extremely isolated. Later DNA from Champigny Sky Cave show evidence of relatives living together and suggested that women often moved between communities. That movement could bring new genes into a group, but distance, population decline, or the disappearance of neighboring bands could still break the network. When there is only one camp left within reach, social rules cannot create partners who do not exist. Modern humans were not automatically immune. Ancient DNA contains rare cases of very close parental relationships, and cultural practices changed across time and place. Farming eventually supported larger populations, which generally reduced background relatedness, but later settled societies also produced occasional cases of extreme close-skin unions. There was never one universal prehistoric marriage system. Still, the broad genetic evidence is striking. For most ancient individuals studied so far, close cousin parents were unusual. Small communities were not necessarily closed communities. Your ancestors survived because the people beside the fire were only part of their world. Beyond the ridge were trading partners. Beyond the river were relatives by marriage. Beyond the familiar hunting ground were strangers who might become allies, hosts, or family. The ability to cooperate outside the closest circle was not a luxury. It protected genetic diversity, spread knowledge, and created support across difficult landscapes. Today, we often imagine survival as the strength of one person or the loyalty of one family. But ancient survival depended on something wider: the ability to form relationships with people who were not already your closest kin. When strangers appeared beyond the trees, they could bring danger. They could also bring the future. If you enjoyed this journey into the distant past, subscribe for more stories about ancient humans and human evolution.